The smoke had a color in Missouri that summer of 1863, a thick gray that hung over the border country like God himself had given up on the place. It weren't the clean smoke of cook fires or even the honest reek of battlefields. It was the smoke of farmhouses burning, of lives turning to ash, of old wood and older dreams going up in flames that nobody bothered putting out no more. The Missouri-Kansas border had become hell's own front porch, and the devil was taking applications from both sides. Weren't no such thing as neutral ground out there. You was either Confederate or Union, bushwhacker or Jayhawker, killer or corpse. The folks who tried staying out of it, well, they ended up dead just the same, maybe deader, 'cause both sides figured if you weren't with 'em, you was against 'em. The Jayhawkers come riding out of Kansas with torches and righteousness, burning every Missouri farm they could find. The bushwhackers rode back the other way, leaving Kansas widows and orphans in their wake. And somewhere in all that blood and fire, whatever passed for law had packed up and rode out, leaving nothing but vengeance to settle accounts. Samuel and Martha Hutchinson had worked their land near Lone Jack for 40 years. Since back when Missouri was still wild frontier and Indians was more common than white folks. They'd raised 6 children on that farm, buried 2 of them, sent the rest off to make their own way. Now they was alone, just 2 old folks trying to live out their days in peace. Samuel was 73, bent and weathered like an old fence post. Martha was 71, hands gnarled from decades of work, but still strong enough to churn butter and tend her garden. They weren't fighters. Hell, they weren't hardly nothing but 2 tired people who'd earned the right to die peaceful in their own beds. But peace weren't something the border country offered no more. The Hutchinsons had sheltered guerrillas twice that spring, nothing more than Christian charity, feeding hungry men and letting 'em sleep in the barn. One of them times, it had been Bloody Bill Anderson's bunch. Bill had been polite, respectful, thanked Martha for the cornbread, and promised he wouldn't forget the kindness. Samuel had shook his hand, told him to be careful out there. Just simple folks doing what decent people do. Kansas didn't see it that way. Now listen here, this story gets darker, much darker. Hit that like button and subscribe right now if you ain't already. 'Cause what's coming is damn brutal, I tell you. What them Jayhawkers done to the Hutchinsons and what Bloody Bill done back ain't the kind of tale you forget easy. Captain Nathan Breckenridge led his Jayhawker company across the border at dawn, 28 men strong, all of them wearing stolen Union blues and carrying torches like they was on some kind of holy crusade. Breckenridge was tall, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that looked respectable in daylight, but turned mean as a snake when nobody important was watching. He'd burned 47 Missouri farms by his own count, kept a little book where he wrote down each one like he was keeping score. Called himself a liberator. The folks whose homes he torched called him something else, something you couldn't say in church. He'd gotten rich off the border war, selling abandoned Missouri land to Kansas settlers, pocketing the profit. The elderly was his favorite targets, couldn't fight back, couldn't run fast, and their death scared whole communities into fleeing. It was pure business to Breckenridge, cold and profitable as winter wheat. The Jayhawkers hit the Hutchinson farm just after sunrise, when the morning mist still hung over the fields like funeral cloth. Samuel was out feeding the chickens. Martha was inside making breakfast. They heard the horses before they seen 'em, that thunder of hooves that every Missouri farmer had learned to dread. Samuel dropped the feed bucket and started for the house, but he was old and slow. The raiders was on him before he made it halfway across the yard. 2 of 'em grabbed him, yanked him off his feet. He tried to fight, swinging his thin old arms, but it was like a child fighting grown men. They laughed, dragging him toward the barn. Martha come running out the front door, screaming her husband's name. She had a kitchen knife in her hand. That's all she had to defend her home with, a knife meant for cutting cornbread. Breckenridge rode up casual-like, leaned down from his saddle, and slapped the knife away. It spun in the air, caught the morning sun, landed in the dust. "Please," Martha begged, her voice cracking. "We ain't done nothing. We're just old folks. Please." Breckenridge smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You sheltered bushwhackers, ma'am, that makes you rebels, and rebels burn." They dragged her across the yard, her feet leaving trails in the dust. Samuel was fighting like a wildcat despite his age, but the Jayhawkers was too many and too strong. They threw both of them into the barn, that old structure Samuel had built with his own hands back in 1839. The Hutchinsons tried to run back out, but the raiders slammed the door shut and barred it from outside with a thick oak plank. The sound of that bar dropping into place echoed across the farmyard like a coffin lid closing. Inside the barn, Samuel and Martha pounded on the door, screaming. Their voices was muffled but clear enough, begging, pleading, asking why, asking for mercy. Outside, the Jayhawkers was pouring kerosene around the barn's base, splashing it up the walls. The smell was thick and wrong, mixing with the morning air and the scent of hay and animals. Breckenridge lit a cigar, took his time with it, let the match burn down almost to his fingers before flicking it onto the kerosene-soaked wood. The barn went up like it had been waiting to burn its whole life. The flames climbed them walls faster than a man could run, eating the old dry wood, turning 40 years of work into hell in minutes. The screaming inside changed, became something that weren't quite human no more, just pure animal terror and agony. Samuel and Martha was burning alive, locked in the barn they'd filled with hay and tools and memories, unable to get out, unable to do nothing but burn and scream and die. The Jayhawkers stood watching, some of them laughing, most of them just standing there like it was normal as sunrise. Breckenridge smoked his cigar and told his lieutenant, "That's how you teach rebels a lesson. You make it hurt. You make it last. You make sure everyone knows what happens when you help bushwhackers." The screaming went on for near about 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Then it got quieter. Then it stopped. The barn was an inferno now, flames reaching up toward the morning sky, smoke billowing black and thick. Inside, 2 people who'd never hurt nobody, who'd raised a family and worked hard and tried to do right, was nothing but charred meat and bone. Breckenridge mounted up, ordered his men to move out. They rode off casual, heading back toward Kansas with their torches still burning, leaving the Hutchinson farm to smolder and die. But they wasn't as alone as they thought. In the cornfield 200 yards away, a neighbor boy named Thomas Miller had been checking his daddy's traps when he heard the horses coming. He'd hid in the corn, watching the whole thing through the stalks. He seen it all, the capture, the locking in, the burning, the screaming, Breckenridge's casual cruelty. He seen the Jayhawkers laugh. He seen the barn burn with 2 old folks trapped inside like animals. When the raiders was gone and the barn was nothing but flames and ash, Thomas ran. He ran all the way home, told his daddy what he'd witnessed. His daddy loaded a horse with food and water and sent Thomas riding through the Missouri hills with one mission: find Bloody Bill Anderson and tell him what happened to the Hutchinsons. It took Thomas 2 days of hard riding, following rumors and whispers, moving through guerrilla networks. He finally found Bill's band camped in a hollow near the Blue River. Thomas was shaking when he told the story, the words tumbling out between sobs, how they'd locked the Hutchinsons in the barn, how they'd burned 'em alive, how Captain Breckenridge had smiled while 2 old folks screamed themselves to death. Bill Anderson sat quiet while the boy talked, his face unreadable. He was 24 years old but looked older, lean and hard as leather, with eyes that had seen too much death. Around him, his men listened. Archie Clement, the James brothers, Cole Younger, Jim Anderson. They'd all heard terrible stories before. The border war was full of terrible stories, but something about this one was different. When Thomas finished, Bill stood up slow. He didn't say nothing at first, just stared off toward where the Hutchinson farm lay. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched. Archie Clement, who'd seen Bill at his worst, would later say it was like watching a door close on whatever humanity was left in Bloody Bill Anderson. Thomas Miller led Bill and 6 of his men back to the Hutchinson farm the next morning. They rode quiet, speaking maybe 10 words between them the whole way. Bill's face was stone, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he could see through it to what waited ahead. Jesse James rode beside his brother Frank, both of them knowing something terrible was coming, but not knowing yet just how terrible it'd get. The smell hit him first about a half-mile out, burnt wood and something else, something worse. The sweet sick stench of burned flesh that once you smell it, you ain't never gonna forget it. The horses didn't like it none, tossing their heads, fighting the reins. Bill kept riding straight and steady, like he was heading to church instead of hell. What was left of the barn stood skeletal against the morning sky, just blackened posts and collapsed beams, still smoking 2 days after the fire. The farmhouse was untouched. Breckenridge hadn't bothered burning it, probably figured it'd be easier to sell with the house standing. The chickens were still pecking around the yard, not understanding their owners was dead. Samuel's feed bucket lay on its side where he'd dropped it. Bill dismounted slow, handed his reins to Cole Younger without looking. He walked toward the barn ruins like a man walking through water, each step measured and deliberate. His men stayed back, letting him approach alone. The bodies were still there. Samuel and Martha Hutchinson had died locked together, their charred remains embraced like they'd tried to protect each other, even as the flames consumed them both. The fire had burned so hot it had melted the metal fixtures, twisted the tools, turned everything to ash and bone and nightmare, but you could still see they was holding each other. Even in death, even burned beyond recognition, you could see that. Bill stood there for a long time staring. His hands was clenched so tight his knuckles went white. Frank James, watching from the horses, would later tell his wife, "I seen Bill look at his own sister's bodies after the prison collapse. I seen him look at massacres and battlefields. But I ain't never seen that look on his face before. It was like looking at winter itself." Bill circled the barn ruins careful-like, studying everything. He found where the door had been, found the oak bar laying in the ashes. It had been on the outside, proof they'd been locked in deliberate. He found the kerosene cans the Jayhawkers had left behind, too lazy or too confident to take 'em. And near the back of the barn he found the lock mechanism, melted but still recognizable. They hadn't just closed the door, they'd barred it and locked it, making damn sure there weren't no escape. Bill picked up that melted lock, turned it over in his hands. His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Then he put it in his coat pocket and walked back to his men. "Archie," he said quiet, "ride to town. Find out who done this. I want names. I want units. I want to know where they're from and where they're going." Archie Clement grinned, that mean little grin he got when violence was coming. "Already know some of it, Bill. Folks in town seen the company ride through. Red-trimmed uniforms, Kansas horses. Captain leading 'em was tall, clean-shaven, wearing officer's insignia. They was heading back toward Lawrence. That'd be Breckenridge," Cole Younger said, spitting in the dirt. "Nathan Breckenridge. He's been burning Missouri farms all spring, getting rich selling the land. I heard about him up in Jackson County. Likes targeting old folks 'cause they can't fight back." Bill looked at Cole, his eyes flat and cold. "You know where he operates from?" "Fortified farmhouse near Lawrence. Keeps maybe 30 men there, rotates 'em for raids. Smart bastard. He don't stay in one place long, don't follow no pattern. But he brags about his raids in Lawrence saloons, tells stories about burning rebels out. Makes himself sound like some kind of hero." "Hero?" Bill repeated, the word tasting like poison. "He's gonna learn what heroes get in Missouri." Jim Anderson, Bill's brother, stepped forward. "We riding to Kansas, Bill? 'Cause that's a hornet's nest Lawrence is crawling with redlegs and militia. We go in there, we might not come out." Bill shook his head. "We ain't going to Kansas. We're gonna wait for Kansas to come to us." He looked at Thomas Miller, who'd been standing quiet, still shook up from what he'd witnessed. "Boy, you done good bringing me this news. Now I need you to do something else. I need you to go home and tell your daddy to spread word. Anyone sees Breckenridge's company crossing into Missouri, they get word to me immediate. Can you do that?" Thomas nodded quick. "Yes, sir, Mr. Anderson. Yes, sir." "Good boy, now get." Thomas mounted up and rode off fast, grateful to be away from them burned bodies and Bill's terrible cold rage. Bill turned to his men. "Frank, Jesse, ride to Independence. Talk to our folks there. See what intelligence they got on Breckenridge's movements. Cole, you and Jim head up to Liberty, do the same. Archie, you're with me. We're going to talk to every family between here and the border, find out when Breckenridge raids, how often, what route he takes." "So you're planning something, ain't you?" Jesse said, his young face troubled. "Something big." "I'm planning justice," Bill said flat. "That captain locked 2 old folks in a barn and burned 'em alive for doing nothing but showing Christian charity. He's going to learn that in Missouri we don't forget that kind of sin, and we sure as hell don't forgive it." Over the next 3 days, Bill's network came through like it always did. Confederate sympathizers across western Missouri fed information to the guerrillas, building a picture of Breckenridge's operations. The intelligence was damning. Captain Breckenridge commanded a company of 28 Jayhawkers, most of them Kansas men with a taste for stealing and burning. They crossed into Missouri every week or two, hit 3 or 4 farms, took what they could carry, and burned the rest. Breckinridge kept meticulous records of the property he seized, selling it through a Kansas lawyer who asked no questions. The captain had personally ordered the deaths of at least 15 Missouri civilians, mostly elderly or infirm, easy targets who couldn't fight back and whose murders terrorized whole communities. But the best intelligence come from a woman named Sarah Perkins, whose husband Breckinridge had killed the previous winter. She'd been watching the Jayhawkers for months, tracking their movements, learning their patterns. She rode out to Bill's camp and told him everything she knew. "He raids on Wednesdays or Thursdays most times," Sarah said, her voice hard as iron. "Likes hitting farms near the Missouri River crossing at Blue Mills. He ain't stupid. He sends scouts ahead, keeps his men tight, don't take unnecessary risks. But he's gotten cocky, Bill. He thinks Missouri bushwhackers is too scared to hit a force his size in daylight." Bill listened quiet, absorbing every detail. "When's his next raid?" "Word is he's planning one in 5 days, bragging about it in Lawrence saloons, saying he's going to burn out the whole Blue Mills area, teach Missouri rebels a final lesson." 5 days, Bill repeated. He looked at Sarah, his face softening just slightly. "Your husband, what was his name?" "Robert Perkins. Breckinridge shot him in front of our children for refusing to tell where our livestock was hid." Bill nodded slow. "I'll remember that name, ma'am. And I promise you your husband's going to be avenged. The Hutchinson's going to be avenged. Every Missouri family Breckinridge hurt is going to be avenged. You got my word on that." Sarah Perkins looked at Bill for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes that might have scared her, if she weren't already so full of grief and rage herself. "Make it hurt, Bill. Make it hurt bad." "Oh, I intend to, ma'am. I surely do intend to." That night, Bill gathered his core men around the campfire. Archie, the James brothers, Cole, Jim, and 10 others he trusted most. He spread out a hand-drawn map of the Blue Mills area, marking the river crossing, the roads, the farms, the tree lines. "Breckinridge is coming through here in 5 days, Bill said, tapping the map. 28 men, probably drunk on stolen whiskey and overconfident as hell. They're going to hit farms here and here, then ride back to Kansas across this ford. That's where we're going to be waiting." Frank James studied the map, his tactical mind already working. "We'll need at least 40 men to be sure. Even drunk and sloppy, 28 Jayhawkers is a lot of guns." "We'll have 40, Bill said. "I'm calling in every guerrilla within 2 days' ride. This ain't just about revenge for the Hutchinsons. This is about sending Kansas a message they ain't never gonna forget." Jesse spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Bill, if we do this, if we do what I think you're planning, there ain't no coming back from it. We'll be worse than anything they call us." Bill looked at his young recruit, his face hard. "Jesse, they burned 2 old folks alive, locked 'em in and listened to 'em scream. You think there's something we can do that's worse than that?" Jesse didn't answer. "Didn't think so," Bill said. "Now, here's the plan. We're going to set a 3-point ambush." Bill's plan was simple, brutal, and damn near perfect. The Missouri River ford at Blue Mills was a natural choke point. Water on one side, thick timber on the other, open ground in between where a man on horseback made an easy target. Breckinridge's company would have to cross there to get back to Kansas with their stolen goods. That's where they'd die. Frank James designed the ambush with the precision of a West Point engineer, though he'd never seen the inside of a military academy. "Archie takes 15 men and blocks the Kansas side of the ford," Frank said, sketching in the dirt with a stick. "Soon as the shooting starts, he cuts off their escape route. Jesse and Cole take 10 men each, hide in the tree lines on both flanks. When Breckinridge's company is halfway across, they open up with everything they got. Crossfire, no escape forward or back." "And me?" Bill asked, though he already knew. "You take the center with Jim and 8 men. You're the hammer. When they try to scatter, you ride 'em down. None of 'em reaches Kansas alive, except Breckinridge and 1 other. Them 2 we take breathing." Bill nodded slow, his face carved from stone. "Which 1 other?" "His lieutenant," Archie Clement said, grinning that mean little grin. "Man who helps give the orders should share the punishment, I reckon." "I reckon you're right," Bill agreed. Over the next 4 days, guerrillas rode in from across western Missouri. Men Bill had fought with, men who owed him favors, men who'd lost family to Jayhawker raids and wanted blood payment. By the morning of the 5th day, 42 guerrillas was camped in a hollow 3 miles from the ford, checking weapons, loading extra ammunition, sharpening knives. They was quiet, focused, deadly. These weren't farm boys playing soldier. These was hardened bushwhackers who'd survived 2 years of the bloodiest warfare the continent had ever seen. Bill walked among them that morning, checking each man personally. He stopped by Jesse James, who was loading his Navy Colt with hands that shook just slightly. "You scared, Jesse?" Bill asked, not unkind. Jesse looked up, his young face pale. "Ain't scared of dying, Bill. I'm scared of what we're fixing to become." Bill crouched down beside him, spoke low so only Jesse could hear. "I know what we're going to become, boy. We're going to become exactly what the border needs. Men who protect Missouri families no matter the cost. You think them Jayhawkers worry about what they're becoming when they burn old folks alive?" "No, sir, I don't reckon they do." "Then don't you worry neither. Justice ain't always pretty, but it's always necessary." Bill stood, gripped Jesse's shoulder once, and moved on. At noon, they rode out to position. Archie's blocking force crossed the river 2 miles downstream, circled through Kansas territory, dangerous as hell, but Archie was fearless, and his men was ghosts. They'd be in position on the Kansas side by mid-afternoon, invisible in the timber, waiting. Jesse and Cole took their flanking forces to the tree lines on either side of the ford. Good cover, clear fields of fire, close enough to hit everything in the killing ground. They settled in, checked sightlines, and went silent. 40 men disappeared into the Missouri landscape like smoke. Bill and Jim took the center position on a low rise 1/2 mile from the ford, hidden behind a stand of blackjack oak. From there they could see the whole approach, the road Breckenridge would take, the ford itself, the killing ground where it'd all happen. They had 8 men with them, all mounted, all ready to ride hard when the time come. Then they waited. Waiting before violence is its own kind of torture. Your nerves get wound tight as banjo strings. Every sound makes you jump, and time moves like molasses in January. The sun crawled across the sky, hot and merciless. Flies buzzed. Horses stamped and switched their tails. Men checked their weapons for the 100th time, wiped sweat from their faces, pissed in the bushes, and went back to waiting. Cole Younger, hidden in the south tree line, watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead and thought about his own family. His daddy murdered by Union militia, his mother driven from her home. He thought about the Hutchinsons burning alive, and his hand tightened on his rifle stock. Jesse James, in the north tree line, prayed quiet-like. He wasn't sure what he was praying for. Forgiveness, strength, maybe just that it'd be over quick. His brother Frank sat beside him, silent and still as stone, his eyes fixed on the road. Archie Clement, on the Kansas side, cleaned his nails with a Bowie knife and hummed a tune his mama used to sing. Archie didn't pray, didn't worry, didn't feel much of nothing except anticipation. Violence was coming, and violence was what Archie lived for. Bill Anderson sat his horse like a statue, one hand resting on his saddle horn, the other holding the melted lock from the Hutchinson barn. He'd been carrying it since the day he found the bodies, a reminder of what they was avenging. His face showed nothing, no rage, no anticipation, no fear, just cold purpose, hard as winter iron. "Bill," Jim said quiet, "you really gonna do it? What you told Frank you was gonna do?" Bill didn't look at his brother. "Every bit of it. Hey, it's gonna haunt us, this kind of thing, it stays with you. Then it stays with us. But Kansas is gonna remember it too, and maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice before burning another Missouri family." Jim nodded slow, accepting it. The Anderson brothers had made their choice long ago, back when the war killed their sisters. There weren't no turning back now. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon when the scout come riding in fast and low, pushing his horse hard. He reined up beside Bill, breathing heavy. "They're coming, Bill, 2 miles out, moving slow. Got wagons loaded with stolen goods, men spread out sloppy. They're drunk, laughing, firing pistols in the air. It's exactly like Sarah Perkins said. They ain't expecting nothing." Bill's eyes narrowed. "How many?" "Counted 26, maybe 28. Breckenridge is riding point with his lieutenant. Bastard smoking a cigar, big as you please." "Good," Bill said, his voice cold as December. "Let 'em come. Let 'em get comfortable. Let 'em think Missouri's too scared to touch 'em." The scout rode off to spread word to the other positions. Bill turned to his men, spoke low and clear. "When I give the signal, we ride hard and fast. Kill every man wearing Kansas red except Breckinridge and his lieutenant. Them two we take alive, understood?" "Understood," Jim said. The others nodded. "Now hold on. Make sure you liked this video, because what's coming next is the reckoning, and it ain't pretty. Anderson's about to deliver hell itself, and Kansas is going to learn what happens when you burn Missouri families. Don't go nowhere." 10 minutes later, they heard him. The rattle of wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, men's voices carrying across the prairie. Breckinridge's company come into view, riding casual and lazy, spread out like they was on a Sunday outing instead of returning from murder and theft. Bill counted 'em careful. 28 men, just like intelligence said. 3 wagons loaded with furniture, livestock, whatever they'd stolen from Missouri farms. Breckinridge rode at the front, tall in his saddle, that cigar glowing between his teeth. His lieutenant rode beside him, younger, nervous-looking, but just as guilty. They reached the ford, started across. Water splashed under hooves and wagon wheels. Men laughed about something, passed a whiskey bottle. One of them was singing off-key. Bill waited until they was halfway across, committed to the crossing, trapped between water and banks, nowhere to run quick. Then he raised his hand, held it there for 3 long heartbeats, and dropped it. The Missouri timber exploded with gunfire. The first volley tore through Breckinridge's company, like the hand of God reaching down to smite 'em where they stood. Jesse and Cole's flanking forces opened up simultaneous from both tree lines, rifles cracking sharp and mean in the afternoon heat. Jayhawkers dropped from their saddles before they even knew what hit 'em. Headshots, chest shots, men jerking and falling into the water that turned red around 'em. Horses screamed, reared, threw riders. Wagons lurched and crashed. The careful military formation dissolved into chaos and blood in about 5 seconds flat. Breckinridge's men tried to scatter, but there weren't nowhere to scatter to. The ones who turned back toward Missouri ran straight into Bill's center force, charging down from the rise, pistols blazing. The ones who tried pushing forward to Kansas ran into Archie Clement's blocking force, emerging from the timber like demons, cutting loose with everything they had. It weren't a battle. It was a slaughter. Bill rode straight into the killing ground, Navy Colt in each hand, firing methodical and deadly. A Jayhawker raised his rifle. Bill shot him through the throat. Another tried running. Bill dropped him with a shot to the spine. Jim Anderson was beside him, just as lethal, just as cold. The Anderson brothers rode through that ford like death's own cavalry, and men fell before 'em like wheat before a scythe. Cole Younger hit a raider so hard with his rifle butt, the man's jaw shattered audible over the gunfire. Frank James, calm as Sunday morning, took careful aim and dropped 3 men with 3 shots, each one center mass, each one fatal. Archie Clement was laughing, actually laughing as he shot a Jayhawker trying to swim the river, put 2 rounds in his back and watched him sink. The whole thing was over in less than 10 minutes. 24 Jayhawkers lay dead or dying in and around that ford. The water ran red with their blood, thick and dark. Bodies floated downstream. Horses with empty saddles galloped off across the prairie. The wagons sat abandoned, their stolen goods scattered in the mud. But 2 men still lived, exactly as Bill had ordered. Captain Nathan Breckinridge and his lieutenant had tried running when the ambush started, but Bill's men had been waiting for exactly that. They'd roped Breckinridge off his horse like a calf, dragged him through the water and mud, stripped his weapons. The lieutenant took a bullet in the leg trying to flee, non-fatal, intentional. He lay in the shallows bleeding and moaning while guerrillas stood over him with guns drawn. Bill dismounted slow, handed his pistols to Jim to reload. He walked to where Breckinridge lay in the mud, tangled in rope, his fine uniform soaked and filthy. The captain's face had gone white as milk, his earlier arrogance evaporated like morning dew. "You know who I am?" Bill asked, his voice flat and cold. Breckinridge's mouth worked, but no sound come out at first. Finally he managed, "Anderson. Bloody Bill Anderson." "That's right. And you know why I'm here?" I was just following orders. Bill kicked him in the ribs hard. Breckinridge gasped, curled up. "Don't lie to me, Captain. You weren't following no orders when you locked Samuel and Martha Hutchinson in their barn and burned 'em alive. That weren't war, that was murder for profit." Breckenridge's eyes went wide. The old couple? We thought they was harboring rebels. They fed some hungry men, Bill said, his voice getting quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. That's all they done. And you burned 'em alive for it, locked 'em in and listened to 'em scream. Please, Breckenridge whispered. I got money, gold, I can pay you. Bill crouched down, got right in the captain's face. You think this is about money? You goddamn fool, this is about justice, Missouri justice, the kind that makes sure Kansas remembers what happens when you hurt our families. He stood, turned to his men. Archie, Cole, get him and his lieutenant on horses. We're riding to the Peterson farm. The Peterson farm was 2 miles east, abandoned since Breckenridge's own men had burned the house 3 weeks prior. But the barn still stood, damaged, scorched, but standing. Bill had scouted it days earlier, knowing exactly what he'd use it for. They dragged Breckenridge and his lieutenant there, the 2 prisoners begging and pleading the whole way. The lieutenant was crying openly, his leg wound bleeding through his pants. Breckenridge kept trying to negotiate, offering information, money, anything. Bill ignored them both like they was insects buzzing. When they reached the Peterson barn, Bill's guerrillas formed a circle around it. 42 men, all mounted, all silent, all watching. Word had spread fast through the Missouri countryside. Families started arriving. Farmers, widows, old folks who'd lost homes and loved ones to Jayhawker raids. They come to witness justice, to see Kansas pay for its crimes. Sarah Perkins was there, the woman whose husband Breckenridge had murdered. The surviving Hutchinson children rode in from Independence. Near about 100 Missouri folks gathered around that barn, quiet and grim-faced, waiting to see what bloody Bill Anderson would do. Bill dismounted, walked to where his men held Breckenridge and the lieutenant. He pulled out the melted lock from his coat pocket, held it up so both prisoners could see. So you recognize this, Captain? It's from the Hutchinson barn. The lock you used to trap 2 old folks inside before you burned them. I've been carrying it since I found their bodies, waiting for this moment. Breckenridge's face went gray. Oh, God. Oh, Jesus Christ. I'm gonna do to you exactly what you done to them, Bill said, his voice cold as a tombstone. That's how justice works on the border, Captain. You taught Missouri a lesson. Now Missouri teaches you one. No, Breckenridge screamed, thrashing against the men holding him. Please, I'm a Union officer. You can't. This is murder. This is war, Bill said flat. Your words, not mine. You said it yourself when you burned the Hutchinsons. Well, war cuts both ways, Captain. Time you learned that. Bill's men dragged the 2 prisoners toward the barn. Breckenridge fought like a wildcat, but he was 1 man against 6 guerrillas. They threw him inside. The lieutenant couldn't walk on his wounded leg, so they carried him in and dropped him on the barn floor. Both men were screaming now, begging, offering anything and everything. Bill walked to the barn door, looked inside at the 2 men who'd caused so much suffering. Samuel and Martha Hutchinson was 73 and 71 years old, he said, his voice carrying to everyone watching. They worked their land for 40 years, raised 6 children, never hurt nobody, and you burned them alive for showing Christian charity. So now you burn, and maybe, just maybe, Kansas will think twice before touching another Missouri family. He slammed the door shut. The heavy oak bar dropped into place with a sound like judgment itself. Inside, Breckenridge threw himself against the door, pounding, screaming. Anderson! Anderson! Please, for the love of God! We're sorry! We're sorry! Please don't do this! The lieutenant was praying, his voice high and broken. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Bill produced a tin of kerosene his men had brought. He walked around the barn, slow and deliberate, splashing it on the walls, the same way Breckenridge had done to the Hutchinson barn. The chemical smell was sharp and wrong in the summer air. Bill, Jesse James said quiet, his face pale. Once you light it, there ain't no going back. Bill looked at him, his eyes empty of everything but purpose. I crossed that line the day I found the Hutchinsons. This is just finishing what Kansas started. He struck a match. The barn went up fast, just like the Hutchinson barn had. Flames climbed the walls, eating the dry wood, turning the structure into an inferno. Inside, the screaming intensified, became something animal, something inhuman, pure terror and agony mixed together. Breckinridge's voice rose above everything. "I'm sorry, oh God, I'm sorry, please, please make it stop." But it didn't stop. The flames kept burning, the screams kept coming, and 100 Missouri folks stood watching, silent as death, witnessing justice delivered the only way the border understood. Blood for blood, fire for fire, suffering for suffering. Sarah Perkins watched with tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness but of relief, of vindication, of finally seeing her husband's murderer pay. The Hutchinson children held each other, unable to look away. Farmers who'd lost everything to Jayhawker raids stood grim-faced and satisfied. The screaming went on for 8 minutes, an eternity of agony. Then it got quieter. Then it stopped. The barn collapsed inward, sending sparks and smoke billowing into the sky. When the flames died down enough to approach, 2 charred bodies lay in the ruins, locked together in death, just like the Hutchinsons had been. Bill walked to the surviving Jayhawkers his men had kept alive as witnesses. 3 men, terrified, bound, forced to watch everything. He cut their bonds himself. "Go back to Kansas," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Tell 'em what you've seen here. Tell 'em what happens when you burn Missouri families. Tell 'em bloody Bill Anderson keeps his promises. And tell 'em if one more old couple, one more widow, one more defenseless Missouri family gets hurt by Kansas raiders, I'll do this again, and again, and again, until Kansas learns to leave Missouri alone." The 3 Jayhawkers ran, stumbling and falling in their haste to get away. They'd carry Bill's message back to Lawrence, spread the story of how Captain Breckinridge died screaming in a burning barn, justice delivered by the man Kansas feared most. Bill stood watching the barn burn itself out, his face showing nothing. Around him, Missouri folks started heading home, their faces bearing expressions ranging from satisfaction to horror to grim acceptance. This was the border. This was how things were settled when law had fled and only vengeance remained. Frank James rode up beside Bill, spoke quiet. "You know what we done here today, Bill. We crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." "I know," Bill said, "but the Hutchinsons are avenged. And maybe, just maybe, Kansas will think twice now. Or maybe they'll come harder. Maybe we just made everything worse." Bill turned to look at Frank, his eyes empty as winter sky. "Then let 'em come. Missouri's got plenty more barns." The smoke from the Peterson barn hung over the Missouri countryside for 2 days, visible for miles in every direction. Weren't just smoke from burning wood neither. It was the smoke of justice delivered, of a message sent, of the border war taking another dark turn toward hell. Word spread fast, the way news always did on the frontier. The 3 surviving Jayhawkers rode back to Lawrence and told their story in every saloon and meeting hall, their voices shaking with terror. Captain Breckinridge, the feared raider who'd burned 47 Missouri farms, had been captured by bloody Bill Anderson and burned alive in a barn, locked inside just like his victims. The details got more horrific with each telling, the screaming, the begging, the slow burn. Anderson's cold face watching it all. Kansas got real quiet after that. Jayhawker companies that had been planning Missouri raids suddenly found excuses to stay home. The flow of Kansas raiders across the border slowed to a trickle. Union Command in Kansas City issued warnings to irregular forces. "Engage bloody Bill Anderson at your own risk, because we can't protect you from what he'll do if you get caught." Wasn't official policy, of course, but it was understood. Mess with Missouri civilians in Anderson's territory, and you'd end up screaming in a burning barn. Lawrence newspapers called it an atrocity. Missouri papers called it justice. Truth was, it was both and neither. It was the border war stripped down to its brutal core, vengeance meeting vengeance, violence answering violence, until nobody could remember who started it or how it might ever end. Bill's guerrillas rode back to their camp in the Blue River Hollow, quiet as ghosts. Weren't no celebrating, no whooping, no satisfaction. They'd done what needed doing, but it weighed on them like wet wool. Even Archie Clement, who loved violence like other men loved whiskey, seemed subdued. The band had lost 4 men in the ambush. Dave Poole took a rifle round through the chest in the first volley, died before he hit the ground. Tom Maupin got shot in the throat trying to rope Breckinridge's lieutenant. James Little and George Todd both fell in the crossfire, good men who'd rode with Bill since the beginning. 4 graves got dug that night, 4 more names added to the long list of border war dead. Jesse James sat apart from the others, staring at nothing. His hands were still shaking, had been shaking since they lit the barn. Frank sat beside him, didn't say nothing, just sat there keeping watch over his little brother, like he always done. "I can still hear 'em screaming," Jesse said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I know they deserved it. I know what they done to the Hutchinsons. But Jesus Christ, Frank, I can still hear 'em." Frank was quiet for a long spell. Then, "You're gonna hear 'em for the rest of your life, Jesse. That's the cost of what we done today. We bought justice for Missouri families, but we paid for it with pieces of our souls. That's how the border works. That's how war works." "Was it worth it?" Frank looked at his brother, his face shadowed in the firelight. "Ask me in 10 years. If Kansas stops burning old folks alive, then maybe it was. If they come back harder and meaner, then we just made everything worse." He paused, spit into the fire. "But either way, the Hutchinsons are avenged. That's got to count for something." Bill Anderson stood watch on a hill overlooking the camp, alone like he preferred it. Jim had tried joining him earlier, but Bill had waved him off. Some thinking a man had to do by himself. He pulled out the melted lock from the Hutchinson barn, turned it over in his hands one last time. The metal was still twisted and warped from the heat that had killed 2 innocent old folks. Now Breckenridge's barn had another melted lock in its ashes. The symmetry was perfect, brutal, and complete. Bill thought about Samuel and Martha Hutchinson, how they'd fed him cornbread and let him sleep in their barn, simple Christian charity that had cost them their lives. He thought about his own sisters, dead in that Kansas City prison collapse. He thought about every Missouri family that had suffered because of this goddamn war, and he thought about what he'd become. Bloody Bill Anderson. The name folks whispered in fear on both sides of the border, the guerrilla who took scalps and burned prisoners and showed no mercy to his enemies. He was 24 years old, and he'd killed more men than he could count, and today he'd burned 2 men alive and watched them scream. Was he a monster? Probably. Was he a murderer? By any civilized law, yes, but there weren't no civilized law on the border no more. There was just survival and vengeance and the brutal calculus of violence repaid. He didn't regret what he'd done, couldn't afford to regret it. The moment you started second-guessing yourself in war was the moment you got killed or went mad. But he understood the weight of it, the darkness that was settling over his soul like Missouri fog over a killing field. "Vengeance burns hot, eats you up inside," he said quiet to the night sky. "Justice is cold, but it lasts." He'd said them words before, believed them with his whole heart. But tonight, standing on that hill with the smell of burned flesh still in his nostrils, he wondered if there was any real difference between the two. Down in Lone Jack, Missouri families gathered to bury Samuel and Martha Hutchinson proper. Weren't much left to bury after the fire, but they had a ceremony anyway, said prayers, sang hymns. Bill Anderson rode in unexpected, still wearing his guns, still covered in road dust. The families parted to let him through, some fearful, some grateful, all respectful. He stood at the grave, hat in hand, and spoke quiet words only the dead could hear. Then he placed the melted lock on the grave marker, a reminder of what had been done and what had been answered. Sarah Perkins was there, her children beside her. She walked up to Bill, looked him straight in the eye. "My Robert can rest now," she said. "Thank you." Bill nodded once, didn't say nothing. What was there to say? He'd delivered vengeance, wrapped in justice, wrapped in horror, and it'd have to be enough. As weeks turned to months, the story of Breckenridge's death became legend. In Kansas, mothers scared their children into behaving by warning, "Act right, or Bloody Bill will come for you." In Missouri, the elderly slept a little easier, knowing someone had avenged the Hutchinsons, knowing Kansas had learned what happened when you burned Missouri families. Jayhawker raids into Missouri didn't stop entirely. The war was too bitter, too personal for that. But they became more cautious, more selective. The casual brutality toward civilians decreased noticeably. Raiders thought twice before torching farmhouses with old folks inside. The name Bloody Bill Anderson had become a deterrent, a warning written in ash and screams. But there was a cost to everything, and Bill paid it in his soul. Each act of vengeance made the next one easier, and that ease was its own kind of damnation. He was becoming the monster Kansas claimed he was, and he knew it, and he couldn't stop, because stopping meant Missouri families would suffer with nobody to protect them. The border war ground on, consuming everything in its path. Bill would live only another year before Union militia killed him in an ambush near Albany, Missouri. He was 24 years old, looked 40, died with his guns blazing and his scalp collection in his saddlebag. But in that last year he'd protect dozens of Missouri families, avenge countless wrongs, and terrify Kansas raiders into thinking twice before crossing the border. The legend outlived the man. Long after Bill was dead and buried, Missouri folks still told the story of how he'd avenged the Hutchinsons. They'd tell about the barn burning, about Breckinridge's screams, about justice delivered cold and brutal and complete. Some told it as a horror story, some as a tale of righteous vengeance. Most told it as both, because that's what it was. Horror and justice mixed together until you couldn't separate one from the other. Years later, Jesse James would tell his wife about that day, his voice distant and haunted. "I learned what hell looked like in that barn," he'd say, "and I learned it from a man I respected. Bill weren't evil. He was just necessary. The border needed someone willing to do terrible things to protect innocent folks. He paid for it with his humanity, but he done what needed doing." Well, there you have it, folks. The story of how Bloody Bill Anderson avenged the Hutchinsons and taught Kansas what Missouri justice looked like. Subscribe if you ain't already, and tell me down in the comments where you watching from and what you think about what Anderson done. Was it justice or was it just more violence feeding the cycle? I want to hear from you. Let's talk about it. The smoke from that barn eventually faded. The ashes scattered in the Missouri wind. But the lesson remained carved into the border's bloody history. Harm the defenseless, and someone will make you answer for it. That someone was Bloody Bill Anderson, and his legacy was written in fire, blood, and the screams of men learning too late that vengeance has no mercy. The border eventually healed, but it took generations. And even today, if you pass through Lone Jack or Lawrence or any of them towns that bled during the war, you'll find folks who remember the stories. They'll tell you about the Hutchinsons, about Breckinridge, about the barn that burned with justice and horror mixed together inside it. And they'll tell you about Bloody Bill Anderson, protector, avenger, monster, hero. All of them things at once, because that's what the border war made of men who tried to do right in a world gone wrong.